morning. Very warm welcome to the inaugural conference of our new English language MA in Contemporary Philosophy and Philosophy of Science. This morning, we shall start with the issues in philosophy of science. Some of you might think that this takes things the wrong way around, that philosophy comes first, and then a subsection of it is the philosophy of science. As it happens, for some of us, philosophy of science was actually the gate through which we entered the holy hall of philosophy. So, by engaging with these huge questions in the pursuit of scientific knowledge, we might actually understand how to work properly in a systematic way as philosophers. It's a great pleasure that this morning opens with a talk by Professor Theodore Arabatzis, and I hand over the chair to Professor Eleni Manolakaki. Let me just draw your attention to the fact that we have both coffee breaks and lunch breaks, so make the best of them. Okay, cheers. Thank you very much.
Hello, good morning. It's wonderful that we're all here now for the first talk of this very promising conference. And let us welcome Professor Theodore Arabatzis, Professor of History and Philosophy of Science in our departments, who is going to talk about contingency and counterfactuals in history and philosophy of science.
Thank you, Eleni. Many thanks to our chair, Honor of Kostas and our colleague Stavros for all the work that they've done for making this conference possible. This talk is based on joint work that I have done with an emeritus colleague, Kostas Gavroglu, and we had a lot of fun thinking about contingency and counterfactuals in history of science, and I hope to be able to convey some of that, some of our fascination with the topic. Now, this is an outline of what I will be talking about. I will discuss the role of contingency and counterfactuals in two kinds of reconstructions of past scientific developments: historical reconstructions on the one hand, and rational reconstructions on the other. The former and the latter exemplify, as I would suggest, two different ways of integrating history and philosophy of science. I will first indicate the role of contingency in understanding historically past scientific practice. And I will suggest that while the contingency of, say, the acceptance of a scientific theory prima facie license counterfactual histories leading to an alternative theory, the articulation of those histories is predicated on two conditions. First, the deliberate neglect of further contingencies along the counterfactual path. And second, and more important, some guiding schema, either causal or inferential, underpinning the unfolding of that path. I will argue that those conditions are not met in proper historical narratives, precisely because those narratives have to incorporate contingent factors. Rather, those conditions can only be met in quasi-historical accounts that are developed in the context of rational reconstructions of past scientific episodes or pedagogical reconstructions of the emergence and acceptance of past scientific theories, the kind of reconstructions that we find in scientific textbooks. Now, in earlier work, I have distinguished two ways of integrating history and philosophy of science, what I call historical philosophy of science and philosophical history of science. Historical philosophy of science is HPS from a philosopher's point of view. The aim of the enterprise is to investigate epistemological and metaphysical issues, familiar issues, the rationality of scientific development, the reality of observable entities, etc., in light of the historical development of science. HPS from a historian's point of view has a very different aim. namely to explore particular historical episodes or general historiographical issues while taking into account philosophical considerations, say about the dynamics of scientific change. And in that paper, I have argued that a philosophically informed approach to the historiography of science can be historiographically fruitful. Along similar lines, my main aim in this section of the talk, is to explore the historiographical implications of the debate on the contingency or inevitability of the process and the products of science. In particular, I would like to understand the ramifications of that debate for understanding science historically. I will outline an explanatory approach to past science based on the intellectual and material resources that were available to historical actors and on the constraints that delimited their available options. I will suggest that those resources and constraints delineate a space of possibilities within which the trajectories followed by historical actors can be explained on the basis of contingent factors such as the biographical trajectories and particular projects of inquiry. Historical accounts of past scientific developments have a descriptive and explanatory function. They describe and explain various things. These are some of the explananda: the rise and establishment of a new discipline, the emergence, consolidation, and development of a new theory, the planning, design, and carrying out of an experiment, the invention and legitimation of a new instrument and a new technique, and finally the conception and the realization of a scientific project. In all of these cases, the descriptive and explanatory functions of the corresponding historical accounts are very closely tied. Both functions are accomplished via narratives which select, order, and draw links between the pertinent primary and secondary sources. Now, in many, if not most of those cases, what we are trying to explain, the explanandum, is shown to be contingent. That is not the inevitable outcome of intellectual, social, or economic process, but rather a result of the contingent decisions and actions of particular actors, either individuals or groups. Decisions and actions that in an important way could have been different. And a very brief example that must be familiar to all of you, the Galileo affair. Several historians have argued that that infamous affair was not the outcome of an inevitable conflict between science and religion, but rather the result of Galileo's unfortunate misjudgment of the orders that he had received from the Catholic Church. Now, I just mentioned the word cause. The role of causation in understanding science historically is a difficult issue. Some historians of science, such as Norman Weiss and John Schuster, have expressed skepticism towards the importation of causal categories, such as influence or shape, into historical accounts of past scientific developments. The main misgiving towards such notions is that they turn past scientists from active agents who consider and choose among a spectrum of possible beliefs and actions to what they call cultural dogs, who are swept away by overpowering historical currents. Rather than being mere puppets, according to those historians, historical actors and scientists in particular should be interpreted as having the capacity to act freely, to adopt beliefs, to make decisions, and to pursue projects of inquiry. Of course, their freedom is not unconstrained. The historical context in which they are situated supplies the resources available to them and imposes a variety of constraints on their choices: material, financial, intellectual, etc. As I said before, those resources and constraints delimit the options available to historical actors without, however, determining them completely. Room is often left for different, contingent choices, which are crucial for understanding the outcome of any given historical episode. If those choices were different, then the corresponding historical narrative would have been different, and the outcome in question would have been different too. Now, the contingent aspects of past scientific developments are important, are crucial indeed for understanding science historically, and to the extent that they could have been different, those contingencies license counterfactual possibilities. This is an important point. I won't analyze it now, but a bit later I will suggest that those counterfactual possibilities cannot be articulated and traced in time beyond a certain point, which is usually very close to the contingency that in the first place licensed the counterfactual in question. Now, other historians of science have been more favorably disposed towards causal or even determinist history. A famous case is Paul Forman's analysis of the impact of Weimar culture on physicists and mathematicians. The ideological currents in the Weimar Republic, according to Forman, were so powerful that they swept physicists away from rationality and into the realm of mysticism, forcing them to betray their disciplinary standards. Now, if Forman were right, then there would be little room for contingency in the explanatory repertoire of the historian of science. Rather, the emphasis should be on impersonal factors that leave little space for significant choices. Within this overpowering context, some choices and the contingent routes to be taken would still be available to historical actors, but it is unclear if they would make any substantial difference. The problem with accounts such as Forman's is that they downplay the plurality of scientists' responses to the historical forces, quote unquote, that purportedly shape their behavior. In the case discussed by Forman, for instance, the physicists and mathematicians' adjustments to the ideological demands of their environment were not alike. Furthermore, some physicists, the name of Pascual Jordan comes in mind, actively pursued the neo-romantic ideologies in Weimar Germany, whereas others, such as Albert Einstein, strenuously opposed them. This indicates that we need a different historiographical approach of how culture and society on the one hand and individual scientists on the other hand are related. A model that leaves room for different, albeit not unconstrained choices, and thus allows for contingent factors to come into play. In the explanatory approach that I sketched before, based on resources and constraints, it was clear that, I hope it was clear that those resources and those constraints narrowed down, but not determine, the choices available to scientists in their pursuits. In this picture of explanation in history of science, there are two elements of contingency. First, the available resources and the operating constraints are historically variable, and to that extent contingent. Second, the traits, aims, and priorities of historical actors may vary from actor to actor, and thus introduce a further element of contingency in the development of scientific knowledge. One could still argue that these contingencies do not affect substantially the content of scientific knowledge. And now I'm moving to the more philosophical part of the talk. They may direct the paths of scientific research by bringing to the forefront certain questions while pushing others to the margins, but they leave intact the outcome of that research, namely observations, experimental results, and scientific theories. Scientific theories in particular, according to this view, are validated on the basis of time-tested epistemic values, such as predictive and explanatory power, internal consistency, coherence with background knowledge, etc. However, on more careful consideration, it turns out again that those values mark the boundaries of a space of possibilities, which which encompasses a plurality of theoretical viewpoints. Quite often in history of science, more than one theory was able to meet the epistemic desiderata in question with comparable success. Let me give you an example. The transition from Ptolemaic to Copernican astronomy. The historical study of that transition has revealed that the choice between those theories was exceedingly complex and remained so for a long time. Both theories were empirically accurate, according to the standards of accuracy that were prevalent at the time, but only the Ptolemaic theory was compatible with accepted background knowledge, that is, Aristotelian physics. The Copernican theory, on the other hand, was qualitatively simpler and more coherent, but made predictions that could not be verified, such as the existence of stellar parallels. Now, what should one have done, if we look at it from a philosophical perspective, a retrospective perspective? What should one have done if faced with such a choice? I think that this question admits no uniquely correct answer. Both choices, at least for a long time, would have been rationally permissible. Each choice would have been based on a different prioritization of different epistemic values. As a matter of fact, very few astronomers had adopted the Copernican system by the end of the 16th century. I quote from a recent book on the scientific revolution, and the author argues that, quote, until 1600, that is almost 60 years after Copernicus' work, no more than 11 astronomers had spoken out in favor of Copernicus' revision. That's a fairly low number. From a philosophical perspective, I would argue that both the proponents and the opponents of the Copernican system responded rationally to a deeply uncertain epistemic situation. If one adds to this already complicated situation Tycho Brahe's sortive system, it becomes clear that the space of possibilities delineated by the prevalent epistemic values at the time allowed more than one choice. The particular choices made by particular historical actors within that epistemic space can only be explained on the basis of contingent factors. So epistemic values function as constraints on the scientific process without, however, completely determining its products. To put this point in familiar philosophical terms, epistemic values often underdetermine scientific developments. They leave space for rational disagreement among scientists. The historical narrative explaining the outcome of a scientific episode should, on the one hand, delineate the space of possibilities, of epistemic possibilities that were available to historical actors in light of their values, the epistemic values that were prevalent in the community under consideration, and then complete the explanation by reconstructing the choices of past scientists on the basis of contingent factors. Now, what about counterfactuals? In a way, the historiographical alter ego of contingency. If the approach to explanation in history of science that I just outlined is cogent, then the historiographical space for counterfactual histories shrinks considerably. Within the space of possibilities available to past scientists, several alternative paths were possible. However, whereas one can reconstruct in some detail the actual path that was eventually followed, the same cannot be said about the unfollowed alternatives. Those unfollowed paths would have in turn involved a potentially infinite number of contingencies, and are thus beyond the scope of historical knowledge. For this reason, I'm skeptical of the few attempts that have been made so far to construct accounts of the long-term consequences of fictitious alterations of the historical record. Here's an example. I think the most impressive among those attempts by a historian of biology named Peter Bowler and his imaginary history of, quote, a world without Darwin. These are his words. He imagines, he has constructed an amazing counterfactual history of biology without Darwin. And it's a very impressive book, outrageous in many ways, but immensely erudite and close to your argument. But I think I don't find it, ultimately convincing, even though I was very impressed by it, because it does not countenance the possibility of further contingencies after the, quote-unquote, deletion of Darwin. So there's a narrative that unfolds without really taking into account that various other possibilities, could have taken place. I don't know, Wallace may have died. Mendel's work would never have been discovered, and so on and so forth. So if you start thinking about counterfactual scenarios, there's no end to that. Now, despite those limitations, the limitations of counterfactuals that I have indicated, they may have other useful functions. And one of those is manifested in so-called rational reconstructions of the history of science, the subject of our next section. And I titled this section, History of Science, as it should have been. This is not my expression. I'm borrowing this term by a historian, German historian named Donald Bloxham, who suggested that historians, and for good reason, reject writing history as it should have happened, but not philosophers. Now, as I argued before, contingency is ineliminable in the historical explanation of past scientific practice, but it has no place in rational reconstructions of that practice. In those reconstructions, such as most famously in Relocating, the rational narrative is a mere unfolding of a particular methodology of scientific research, exemplifying the various aspects of that methodology. The aim of Lakatos's narratives is to trace an alternative, actually a counterfactual path, to the outcome of a past scientific episode involving competing scientific theories, or what Lakatos calls research programs. The possibility of constructing such a path, according to Lakatos, amounts to a rational explanation, or that's his terms, or rather, from my perspective, a post hoc justification of that outcome. Now, while a lot has been written about Lakatos' methodology of scientific research programs, there has been almost no discussion of the extent to which its application to history of science involved a heavy use of counterfactual reasoning. A brief glance at Lakatos' writings will make this apparent. His employment of counterfactuals is evident in his discussion of two research programs, William Prout's in the 19th century and Niels Bohr's in the early 20th century. Prout's program was based on the hypothesis, and these are Lakatos's words, quote, that all atoms are compounds of hydrogen atoms, and thus atomic weights of all chemical elements must be expressible as whole numbers. According to Lakatos's rational reconstruction, Prout, quote, knew very well that anomalies abounded, but said that this arose because chemical substances, as they ordinarily occur, were impure, end quote. To Lakatos' consternation, though, actual history was rather different. Here's another quote. Prout denied the existence of any anomalies. Lakatos then proceeds with tracing, quote, the impact upon other chemists of the fictional writings of the fictional Prout. Start getting confusing, but it's very interesting nevertheless. And this, I think, is what makes his reconstruction counterfactual and not a mere falsification of the historical record. Let's move now to Lakatos' discussion of Bohr's program. Again, he continues to take liberties with the historical record and engage in counterfactual stories. We read, for instance, that, quote, Bohr's plan was to work out first the theory of the hydrogen atom. Among the first steps in carrying out that plan was, quote, taking the possible spin of the electron into account. That's in the main text. But then there's clarification in a footnote where he says that, well, this is a rational reconstruction. As a matter of fact, Bohr accepted this idea only in 1926. Again, the aim of tampering with the historical record is to support Lakatos's contention that Bohr's program was driven, or actually could have been driven, by its positive heuristic, the idea that atoms are analogous to binary systems and not by experimental evidence. That contention in turn gives rise to the following counterfactual. The progress of science would hardly have been delayed had we lacked the laudable trials and errors of the ingenious Swiss school teacher, that is Johann Balmer, who discovered the homonymous series with the spectrum of the hydrogen atom. The speculative main line of science carried forward by the bold speculations of Planck, Rutherford, Einstein, and Bohr, who would have produced Balmer's results didactically as test statements of their theories without Balmer's so-called pioneering. So, to illustrate his philosophical account of the development of science as a series of competing research programs driven forward by their own internal dynamic, Lakatos had to resort to counterfactuals. His rational reconstructions are narratives exemplifying the tenets of his methodology of scientific research programs with no sensitivity whatsoever to the contingencies involved in what actually transpired in the corresponding historical episodes. In contrast to historical accounts, which, as I've suggested earlier, need to incorporate various contingencies, Lakatos's internal histories leave no room for contingencies, but include counterfactual stories of how past scientists would and should have behaved if they had followed Lakatos's methodology. To put it another way, Lakatos puts himself in the shoes of a past scientist and shows how to radically improve, I mean, these are his words, upon his or her deeds. Now, even when Lakatos protested in response to criticism, and I think the more important among the criticism were Thomas Kuhn's, that Lakatos protected that he made, quote, no attempt to protect himself from real history. He retained the taste for counterfactual history. And this is another really colorful passage in a paper that he co-authored with Eli Zahar on the Copernican revolution. He described that episode as, quote, narrowly internal. Its progressive part could have taken place at any time, given a Copernican genius between Aristotle and Ptolemy, or in any hereafter, say the 1175 translation of the Almagest into Latin, or for that matter by an Arab astronomer in the 19th century. So what's the important thing according to Lakatos is that the outcome of the internal history, no matter the contingencies, the time order, and so on, what is that outcome? The replacement of Ptolemy's program by Copernicus's was the same with that of actual history. So that replacement was vindicated by Lakatos's methodology, and conversely, Lakatos's methodology was supported by it. And that was precisely the reason for bringing up counterfactual possibilities, not to gain historical understanding, but to defend and articulate the implicit rationality of past scientific development, and to show how the rationality in question was captured by Lakatos's methodology. So, to move towards the conclusion. But Lakatos' reconstruction, most notably those of Brown's and Bohr's research programs, embody counterfactual elements, such as rearrangements of time order. You remember the quote I read before about Bohr having in mind spin in 1913. That happened much later, but for Lakatos, that was an insignificant contingency. The purpose of those counterfactuals is to suggest alternative paths to the results reached by actual science. So the results stay the same. The results are not disputed or challenged by Lakatos, but he comes up with an alternative path to those results, and that path would and should have been followed if past scientists were fully rational and adhered to Lakatos' methodology. Now, I spent a lot of time with Lakatos, and he made me angry. Until I started reading him as a counterfactualist. If you read him in this way, then you may provide a charitable interpretation of his tampering with the historical record. A counterfactualist interpretation makes clear that the aim of his enterprise was not to shed light on what actually happened, but rather to vindicate, on the basis of his methodology, the end results of often tortuous and contingent developments. And I find that worth a philosophical aid. Now, some concluding remarks. In the first section of this talk, I highlighted the ineliminable role of contingency in historical explanations of how scientific knowledge is created and validated. While in the remaining sections, I focused on the central role of counterfactuals in rational reconstructions of scientific developments by philosophers of science. My purpose in contrasting the historiographical uses of contingency with the philosophical uses of counterfactuals was to show that contingency and counterfactuals cater to very different needs. Furthermore, I suggested that the articulation of counterfactuals has to be underpinned by a driving quote-unquote mechanism consisting of predictable causal processes, as in Forman's case, or inferential connections, as in Lakatos' case, and operating without interference from external contingencies. Such a mechanism cannot be found in actual history of science, but only in rational reconstructions, which thus enable counterfactual narratives to get overcome. The conceptual connection notwithstanding, contingency and counterfactuals turn out to be odd bedfellows after all. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Theodore. Well, some contingencies are fulfilling, interesting, and stimulating. And I do not know whether they are in need of some kind of intellectual reconstruction. I don't know. So, please, questions.
Thanks very much. Now, I have two questions. The first is about contingency. You contrasted contingency with inevitability, but I think the whole talk should make some distinctions regarding contingency. You said, in the beginning that things could have been different, which is one account of contingency. Then at the end, or in the middle or towards the end, you spoke of rationally permissible. But in between, one might also speak of justified, not rationally justified necessarily, but justified contingent developments, to take into account differences of what is considered rational. Because, I mean, you don't want just to speak of things could have been different, because everything can be different. Everything is contingent, right? Metaphysically speaking, everything is, I mean, even the laws of nature are contingent, right? They could have been different. But you don't want to speak of that contingency, and if you narrow it down to rationally justify developments, that would make it perhaps more anachronistic. So you need, I think, a third. I mean, justified in terms of what they thought was rational. So that's one thing. The second is about Lakatos. Why would you call it necessarily counterfactual what he's doing, and not, I mean, perhaps see it as a kind of speculative history, philosophy of history, like the Hegelian, let's say, where the philosopher sees through the contingencies and biographical accidents of actors and looks at the underlying pattern of development, perhaps. So it's not necessarily a counterfactual account. And I mean, Lakatos was not criticized for, for falsifying history, but I mean, for using history to justify his model in that way. I mean, manipulating history to justify his model, right? Anyway.
No, I didn't have metaphysical contingency in mind because I don't want to enter into any problem whether history is metaphysically contingent or metaphysically necessary. I have my own views, but I'd rather stay clear of the whole debate. What is important, I think, both historically and philosophically, is that the way science developed, one can plausibly claim that was epistemically convincing, in the sense that there were different possibilities, different options, and the ones that were pursued not because they were epistemically, they were not forced on the actors or on every actor, but were chosen for several contingent reasons. Right? This doesn't make the whole process irrational, right? But I think points the way to a more liberal conception of rationality. Now, with respect to Lakatos, I think if you look at this passage, it's a clear counterfactual claim, right? So if Palmer never existed, this would have hardly delayed the progress of science. This is a counterfactual claim. Okay. Now, if you're right that this claim is based on Lakatos's, I don't know, Hegelian intuitions about the underlying rationality of science, so this intuition enables you to license this counterfactual claim. But it is a counterfactual claim nevertheless, I think. And not just that. I mean,
one might take it that all these contingencies as superficial developments, like the Annal school would describe them.
Fine. Yeah. I mean, there must be an underlying process going on. Okay, that's the important aspect of scientific development. The rest are minor perturbations. They may delay the process. They may speed up the process. But the essential aspect of the process is captured by some kind of mechanism, either epistemic mechanism or, I don't know, in the sociologist's case, a social mechanism.
thanks very much for the talk. So it's assimilating counterfactual histories with the rational reconstructions, but my sort of way of thinking is to sort of pull those apart a little bit. I mean, I think of a sort of counterfactual history as sort of neutral with respect to the rational assessment. You know, things happen a particular way, here's a way they could have happened. But, you know, that's just another way, it might be good or bad. You can rationally assess that, but the philosophers, at that point, the philosopher might say, well, look, here's the counterfactual story, and that gives you the real rational evidence. But what's doing the work there is that you're sort of endowing that counterfactual history with the kind of title of this gives you the rational reconstruction. So it seems to me that the counterfactual story isn't really doing very much work, it's just in an alternative way things could have gone, but it's only really, you know, the real oomph is when you say, and that's the rational course of events, which you could have said without giving a kind of counterfactual history. So in a way, it seems to me the counterfactual stories and the rational reconstructions are somewhat fairly independent.
Yeah, okay. I take the point that they are not fully equivalent. Okay, not every counterfactual is a rational reconstruction. But on the other hand, a rational reconstruction, to the extent that cannot accommodate, you know, all the decisions that were taken in the past, or you know, the beliefs of the historical actors, then has to, you know, resort to a counterfactual story. Okay, how things would have developed if the actors, if the scientists were fully rational. So if they were fully rational and, you know, adopted, you know, this particular methodology, then they would have behaved in a certain way. But this is a counterfactual, of course, because they didn't behave in that way. So there is a link, but I agree with you that, you know, they're not one and the same thing. The rational reconstruction, in a way, licensed the counterfactual. But of course, not every counterfactual is based on a rational reconstruction.
I mean, it might be that that's just for illustration. If really what the rational reconstruction is, it doesn't really talk about the actors, it talks about the evidence available to the actors. So it's a kind of atemporal link between the evidence available to the actors and the theories they espouse. You can then spell it out counterfactually to illustrate it, but it seems that what's really going on is the atemporal, not actor-related link between the evidence and the theory.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm okay with that. No, the important thing is not, I would agree with that, is the rational reconstruction, because it exemplifies, you know, this particular methodology. So the counterfactual is invented for the purposes of illustration. Okay. But it is invented on the basis of the methodology. Because the methodology is necessary for, you know, getting the counterfactual off the ground. How will things have developed? How do we know? We know because, you know, given the methodology, the available evidence, and, you know, the competing theories, there was, you know, a best way to proceed that is captured by the methodology.
Thank you very much. It's really very thought-provoking talk. At some points you mentioned the internal-external distinction, and it seems that it almost coincides with this contingent, inevitable distinction. So the internal factors are the inevitable ones, and if there's something contingent, then it has to be explained by external factors, and that you can also map this perhaps on a rational external distinction. So, I mean, that is itself perhaps not inevitable to map it that way. Some of the internal things are still contingent. There's contingency in the even without being like a wide-eyed social constructionist, so you can admit that there are many truths to be discovered about the world and the way we focus on this area or that area or this description or that. There's a lot of, certainly a lot of contingency in that. So I think the question is, do you think that these distinctions align, like the contingent, inevitable distinction and the internal external distinction, do they align for you, and what do you think that they have to align for the Lakatosian counterfactualist point of view to work?
Thank you. That's an excellent question. I think they should align for Lakatos and his followers, but not for me. The internal history, according to Lakatos, is whatever can be accommodated or justified by his methodology. Okay, so in that sense, there is a kind of inevitability. If you behave rationally, if you adopt a methodology, then there's a single way to go. But I have a more permissive conception of rationality. I mentioned before epistemic values and the fact that they often underdetermine scientist choices, not forever, but in a particular historical juncture. And it's actually permissible to make different choices. So internally considered from the point of view of epistemic values, those choices are not forced. Okay, the epistemic values leave room for disagreement. So particular choices are epistemically contingent, in that respect. So I think that for Lakatos, this is a really insightful point. For Lakatos, there is a link between the internal and the inevitable, but it's not inevitable to be this way. It doesn't have to be this way.
Thank you. I want to have some feedback on the metaphysical and epistemological interest within this counterfactual and contingency narrative. There are two things to see this. In a frame of ultimately converging scientific history, we might have contingencies upon specific nodes, this counter that way or this way, but on the long run, ultimately, everything will converge upon one single scientific theory. So, okay, this is interesting, but would this counterfactual and contingency narrative cope with or be open regarding counterfactuals or contingencies that are compatible with one another? Could scientific history have evolved in ways that are incompatible with the one that has actually evolved, or even, if not incompatible or contradictory, uncommensurable? Or does this
Let me try to rephrase this to make sure that I understood the point. You said that, according to the account I presented, contingency seems to be important in the short run, but in the medium or in the long run, it was pretty much inevitable.
I have not suggested that you said that.
Okay.
It was a question. How do you perceive this? Is scientific history ultimately converging upon one single scientific theory, or could the paths that could have been taken in the past or in the future lead to two incompatible with one another scientific theories, or even with two scientific theories that are contradictory with one another?
This is a very difficult question. In the book I mentioned before, this book Down and Deleted, it's a counterfactual story of how biology, would have developed if Darwin would have drowned, while he was on the Beagle. but it's a counterfactual story with more or less the same outcome. Okay, so contemporary biology would have been more or less the same. The path to our present knowledge would have been different, and according to Bowler, the science-religion debates would not have been as acrimonious as they were, or even Nazis, the Nazi appropriation of Darwin, wouldn't have taken place, and so on and so forth. But what we now know, or think we know about biological processes, would not have been all that different. So in that sense, I think Bowler is an inevitabilist about scientific development in the long run. I'm not so sure. I mean, I won't commit myself. I mean, I find this a very strong claim. But again, it's a very debatable claim. It depends on your disposition toward realism and so on and so forth.
And the last question, Chris.
Thanks, Theodore. That was extremely interesting. I've got a short sort of comment or question that has to do with what you said at the beginning of your talk, which was about explaining science. Okay, and so I would like to ask whether you and Kostas, when you were considering how to conceptualize the whole issue, whether you had some thoughts on the perennial debate between structure and agency in philosophy with social science. Because if science is a social phenomenon, so the first thing you say, okay, who is the agent, what's the structure, and how do they connect? Whereas you seem to focus on contingency, historical resource, pools. So I just was wondering whether you have considered it and rejected it or whatever.
No. Well, again, this is an important and difficult question because we have not, in all honesty, come up with a full-fledged account of historical explanation. Okay, so there was merely a sketch meant to highlight the role of contingency in explanatory accounts of past scientific developments. I think that our talk about resources and constraints anyway captures some aspects of what we call the structural situation. These are elements. I mean, historical actors find themselves in a certain situation that can be described in terms of the constraints that operate on them, the resources that are available to them, and so on. But then how they appropriate those resources, how they deal with those constraints, I mean, it's not predetermined. And you see that in practice because different people react differently to the same structure, as it were. So the short answer is no. I mean, we do not have developed. I mean, that wasn't the aim. The aim was to start thinking about contingency and counterfactuals. This is a hot topic in contemporary historiography. So we want to rethink it and connect that debate to the philosophy of science also. But again, there's a lot of work to be done. I mean, if one wants to develop a full-fledged account of historical explanation that would incorporate contingency, I mean, this would be a book length. This would require, I think, a book length treatment. That's something that unfortunately we haven't done.
Thank you very much, Theodore, for this. We have a short break now, 10 minutes, and so that to make the arrangements because there's going to be a non-lunch talk. The next talk is going to be a lunch. We need some time to make the arrangements.
Μια χαρά, πώς πάει. Μια χαρά. Ωραία. Ωραία.